Let's bring in former NDP leader Tom Mulcair, nowadays CTV political commentator, to get his take on this. You yourself, as you know, of course, in a previous career, were a bureaucrat, then a politician. You know how all this works. How significant, Tom, was it to see Michael Wernick there speaking, not only in the committee, but then coming out and talking to the media?
Well, he was obviously sent in with a mission, and his mission was to try to say that nothing had ever happened that was untoward. But the more he spoke, especially in the scrum part, the more he revealed that indeed he had been talking with Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was the Attorney General. He wasn't one of her cabinet colleagues. He was a senior civil servant working for the Prime Minister, talking to her. Do you realize the number of jobs involved, the communities, the suppliers? That's what you call pressure. The game that they're starting to try to play is, but was it undue pressure? I don't know where the word undue came from. The real question is, are you allowed to try to pressure an attorney general? And there's reference, I mean, it gets a bit obscure, but to the Shawcross principle, which is essentially something out of Great Britain in the early 1950s, which is whether or not you can even have discussions with an attorney general. And the principle as laid down by the courts is, of course you can, especially with colleagues around the cabinet table. So who is Michael Wernick to become that colleague? The other thing that you've just alluded to, and Michel Boyer was mentioning as well, is whether or not solicitor-client privilege applies. According to Mr. Wernick, it doesn't. Well, now that's interesting, but what Mr. Trudeau has been saying for the past couple of days is that somehow cabinet privilege, you know, like Maxwell Smart's dome of silence, follows you around in the corridor and into the Prime Minister's office. So if you're talking between the Prime Minister and a minister in the Prime Minister's office, yesterday Mr. Trudeau affirmed that somehow, miraculously, your cabinet privilege applies there. So maybe they're trying to release her on the grounds of, well, there's no solicitor-client privilege. But if they're still continuing to say that when you're talking with the Prime Minister in his office and you're a member of cabinet, you're subject to cabinet secrecy, it's an even higher level of secrecy, Todd. So, I mean, that's why this is a bit of a game right now. And it is an attempt, as far as I'm concerned, to simply reduce it down to a question of argument over perception. Well, of course it wasn't undue pressure. Was it pressure? Well, maybe she felt that it was pressure, but I was just trying to give her context. That was the word that Mr. Wernick had prepared in advance and kept going back to. So that's what it's going to come down to. Nobody's arguing the other side right now. That's not the question anymore of whether or not SNC-Lavalin should be allowed to keep 9,000 jobs and to prosper. Everybody wants that. The British have given themselves this type of instrument for their companies. The Americans years ago gave their companies this type of instrument. But that's not the issue here. That's a distraction to try to say that this is what this is about. What it's really about is our system, our Attorney General, whether there were people trying to pressure her to come to a different decision. That's the issue here. It's not a question of whether or not Lavalin should be allowed to survive. It's whether or not we're being told the truth about this whole issue by the Prime Minister's office and the people around him.
So does it not then, Tom, become a question of he said, she said? So the top bureaucrat says, look, I spoke to her. We went over how important SNC-Lavalin is to Quebec, to the economy in that province, also elsewhere in the country, all the jobs that are at stake here, the suppliers, the pensioners, one of those rare Canadian champions that are still out there, you know, and she may have interpreted differently. By the way, you're the Attorney General. It's up to you, of course. Just be aware that if this goes to trial and they are convicted of fraud and corruption, that could bring the company down. No more government contracts for 10 years. What would that do? Just be aware of that.
Well, let's start with that very last part. That's a Canadian government rule. It's a rule laid down in our statutes by Parliament. That could easily be changed. They've got a majority. They could waive that 10-year rule. There are still possibilities, because David Lametti said it on CTV's question period in answer to a question from Evan Solomon. Do you still have the option? He says, yes, I could still act. So it's not a question of whether or not there was still a possibility of acting. It was a question of who would override whom. So was it going to be Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was prevailed upon to try to override her Director of Public Prosecutions, who said that in good conscience, as a lawyer looking at this case, the rules wouldn't adapt to this case? Or would it be the Canadian government itself saying, you know what, we're ready to take the political hit? What I'm sensing here is that they knew there was going to be political blowback on this. And they didn't want that blowback to come and scorch the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office, but they didn't mind if it scorched an individual minister. And more than anything else, they didn't want to have the heat. Well, that didn't work out very well, because for 3 weeks, this is all we've been talking about, Todd.
Some great insights, as always, Tom. Thank you for taking the time to come on the program today. I have a feeling we'll be talking again in the not-too-distant future.
Probably, Todd. All the best. Take care.